So let me just see how it goes. Okay, so we talk about current state of architectural discourse. We are trying to understand the scaffolding that has developed, or we are trying to dismantle the scaffolding, that is developed in understanding of architecture. So this is a very important topic. This is very critical and very crucial topic in architectural discourse. And it is not about writing on architecture, but it is about the way we teach, the way we practice. I think so it's a very crucial thing. So there are three framework I feel that requires to understand. One is a theoretical framework. Basically the concept and premises that explains the grounded condition. How do you establish grounded condition? Now, this is going to be a little abstract lecture where you need to really dissect this further. And what are the scaffolding of discourses that emerge when you talk about grounded condition? Trying to establish the premises on which explains the grounded condition. So that is theoretical framework. The conceptual framework essentially deals with architectural curriculum, the logical development of architectural curriculum in India. I mean, I'm sure you all know architectural education established by British primarily to facilitate the offices where we would serve more like an assistant, draftsman who understands technicalities, who understands translation of those technicalities into the site. So it is heavily based on technique of understanding, reading drawings and execution. So on onset itself, there is an absence of research or importance of research that contributes to the knowledge of architecture. I think that is the fundamental conditions in conceptual framework. Many other things can emerge from this, but broadly, conceptual framework lacks any research inquiry. And in order to enable research inquiry, you need to bring objectivity. And very simple argument I always talk about: we are not teaching technology, we are teaching technique. The technological discourses are much more wider and philosophical in nature. We are just teaching technique, and we presume that technique means equals to architecture. And discursive framework, primarily it hinges on simple argument. There is an absence of dialogue. We do not have dialogue. That's a broad statement, and that is perhaps due to absence of critical framework, or not able to understand the difference between criticism and criticizing. And this also couples with the idea that what do we criticize? We criticize data, information, knowledge. I think it is much wider gap that exists in our understanding of discursive framework. And discursive framework also means the practice, because that's where you actually disseminate your knowledge. But going forward?
No, we are still on the set. Yeah, now it is. History, architecture and contemporary. Yeah.
So when you talk about the theoretical framework, trying to locate grounded condition, you really actually talking about history. And whether this class has done modern architecture in India or modern architecture in the globe, primarily you are looking at history. And the discourse on architecture is central to all the conversation. And when we talk about discursive kind of framework, we are looking at the contemporary. So there is a kind of a history on one side, contemporary on other side. And we are trying to imagine architecture, architectural pedagogy, architectural writing, and all kind of discussion that happens between these two extreme conditions. So let's look at slowly, what do we understand by history? I mean, it's unfortunate that history, right from schooling till today, it's all about dates and facts. It's not really looked at in a larger, idea of philosophy of history. What do philosophy of history do? It's a process of, interpreting the past. It's also about locating history of ideas, what ideas prevailed, how ideas have developed. And when you really talk about how ideas have developed, you actually begin to question the historicism, the authenticity of historicism, that how those ideas have developed. It's also a kind of intellectual construct. History broadly is about progress towards rationality or philosophy drawn from example. And I think Kosambi said it's a transmission of acquired skill. Just to kind of, when I'm referring to Kosambi, there are few objective historian India has produced. Kosambi is one of them. One of the prime historian, which is generally absent in all the curriculum, is Professor Jadunath Sarkar, who brought about a lot of discipline and understanding of history and bringing certain sense of objectivity in the history. And in Indian context, when we talk about objectivity in history, we often invite a lot of conflicts. We also invite a lot of confrontation, because history is heavily depending on the mythology and belief. Architecture, the discourse on architecture is an intellectual space construct for living. I mean, it's a broad term that we are looking at. This term I'm using to kind of contextualize architecture between history and contemporary. And contemporary is a living and occurring at the same time. We live in simultaneity. There is so many simultaneous time that we live in. And I think one has to give a thought to it. One has to objectify that. Okay, I have this kind of parallel existence, and that brings my existence to be a contemporary. And how do I really interpret the occurrence of contemporary with respect to history? And when I look at these two relationships in context with space making, the architecture emerges. So, intellectual space construct, the making of architecture in a contemporary time, is about connecting with the history. So it all depends how really one connects with the history from contemporary. So this is one of those early idea of the framework that I talked about. The first one where I'll just go back. Theoretical framework and idea of understanding history is almost collapsing into each other, and try to bring a new relationship with the way we exist and the way we imagine our space to be. So, sorry. So when it comes to the second framework, where conceptual framework, how do we position architecture today? And obviously the answer lies in one of those contextual ideas that you talk about. I think very often architectural discourse is absence of context. And I think we are fortunate that in our institute we talk about context all the time. And absence of context means the simultaneous coexistence is really is left to kind of uncertain parameter, and what we call it architecture of everywhereness. I'm sure you have learned in your modern architecture. And when we talk about contextual specificity, architecture tends to kind of position itself. It's a positioning of architecture. And when you really identify the process and product, What has influenced the process? It's a similar thing as what has influenced the history of ideas. Trying to locate historicism, trying to locate the circumstances within which the decisions are made. The process is set. The critical framework is always set for the process. Because product is something which is reality. The product cannot exist without the process, and process is a way in which you employ various concerns that enables your architectural understanding. And I think contemporary process and the critical framework really talks about the process. And when we engage any kind of writing or architectural discourse, we simply plunge into the product. We do not really talk about the process through which decisions are made. And when I look at the process, I think I tend to refrain from using word good architecture or bad architecture. I use the word what is appropriate, how certain things are appropriated, whether it's a political appropriateness, the social appropriateness, or any other kind of elemental process of appropriation. I think we try to put architecture in an appropriate framework. So I think one of the key thing about architectural discourse is what is appropriate. And when you say what is appropriate, we talk about the context automatically, and we talk about the history. So when you talk about appropriate, when you talk about critical framework, as I said, historicism becomes central to the entire process. What has caused? We all have learned various historical facts, dates, wars, history of war, history of crime, history of nation, nationalism, history of state, history of colonialism, but there are certain circumstances that existed. This is what we call it positivist theory. Positivist theory talks about history has come about because there are certain prevailing parameters. And if those parameters were not prevailing, the event would not have happened. So it is about kind of looking at scientific base to historicism. And when you base your whole argument on scientific and reason, I think your critical framework is very, very objective in nature. So coming to the conversation on discourse, the first and fundamental thing is discourse is a dynamic phenomena. It's not a static. You cannot have one and only one view on your discourse. There are many views. You have to accept multiple views. It's a dynamic. And when the views coupled with other views, what we call it, kind of a multidisciplinary approach. And multidisciplinary approach allows you to look at various views together. And when you put all views together to develop a new framework, you are actually talking about a transdisciplinarity. I think we can have a separate discussion on this discipline discourse, which is important for you all. So discourse questions can come about various ways. These are some of these few things I am talking about. And I'm sure Nemish and Rutika must have discussed many more pertinent, questions on discourse.
In the world, Leo plans to infiltrate the gang. I want contracts. Pink Panthers for my freedom.
Saita, can you mute yourself, please?
So the discourse question really can be initiated through academic intent. What is the academic intent? I think we always talk about academic pedagogy, and that's something to start with. And it is unfortunate that we have almost 500 institutes in India. And when we talk about academic intent, when we talk about academic pedagogy, I think there is an absence of pedagogy. And largely or mostly it is depending on those framework which prevailed over more than 50-60 years. I mean, the way history is taught, the way the the technology is taught or the way the various things are taught, I think academic intent lacks kind of a pedagogical structure, and that is because it lacks the understanding of place. I think place as a laboratory is very, very important. You need to position your academic intent into a geography. The second, of course, to me is a very, very important one, which is the social phenomena and social reality. Discourse is about how we exist in space. It is as simple as that. And what are our priorities? What is our social reality? What are our cultural priorities? If you try to look at various aspects of social phenomena, a lot of discourse question can come from that. And thirdly, when we talk about place, I think place not necessarily as a limited geography, but place is a region. I think very often we say Mumbai is not a city, Mumbai is a region, because it really governs many things around. And I think we need to operationalize the regional questions, and that to facilitate the discourse questions. And one of the key thing about discourse is that you must accept that complexity is irreducible, and they will be challenging all the time. Architectural discourse, architectural writing will become more and more complex over a period of time, and that's something that we need to accept. And lastly, and I think very important one, which I can say it really proudly, that global perspective on architecture is something that we must have. I mean, we are fortunate that faculties at KRVI are globally exposed and they can talk about global architecture, the global conversation, global dialogue, or a discourse. And this allows you to position your conversation in a particular geography, in a particular region. So global perspective is very, very important. There are certain institutional questions that comes about, when you talk about institutions, when you talk about various things that really happens either academically or research, there are certain questions that comes. And I think we must understand that there is a division of knowledge, and and division of knowledge actually hints for a possible cooperation. Architecture is no more a heroic phenomena. I'm sure this all must have been discussed by Nemish. Architecture is no more heroicness. Architecture is far more grounded, and it goes beyond the heroicness. And as we see, the more and more complex layers are added, architecture discourses are also moving into a new realm on environment, ecology, climate change. And I think there is a division of knowledge that exists, and I think there is a possible new cooperation. You need new cooperation. I think, as I said, region. I think region means the local knowledge that is produced in political and administrative context. I think one must be aware of this knowledge to kind of mobilize any kind of discourse writing. One also needs to conceptualize the interface between aims of academic and practice. We always differentiate these two conveniently, but I always believe that practice is an academic attempt, while academic is a practice attempt. I mean, once you change this definition, I think there is a lot of possibilities to create the interface. Dialogue across the border of knowledge producer. There are various knowledge producers, and as I think as you spend more and more time in architecture, your architectural question also expands. They are no more like question that you would have asked in first and second year. And when you move to your thesis, your question will become much wider. And I think for that, you need to understand, you need to have a dialogue with a knowledge producer. And of course, the information on power structure, how power structure comes about, what knowledges are produced, how they are executed. One has to be very, very much aware and not go by what someone says. And of course, as we move into the practice realm, it's a method to deal with power factor. Power factor comes at various scales, and this is how actually you really understand the method of writing through a power factor. And of course, the knowledge questions. Knowledge questions are very important. One and primary, most important, knowledge for exchange. Basically, how do you exchange knowledge? How do you find common interest? How do you find common question? I think these are all knowledge questions, and this can be done, by mobilizing new, ways of creating knowledge communities. I think architecture has been, very exclusive. Let me be very honest. I mean, the kind of architecture that we have studied, or even Nemish, as a matter of fact, not far from when I graduated, but it was seen as a very exclusive profession. And we tend to isolate ourselves, we tend to enable these knowledge communities. We need to develop practice of knowledge. I think practice of making building is a practice of knowledge exchange. It's a way you disseminate your ideas, your knowledge, your act of making things. Very important part, respect context of knowledge. I think the context, every knowledge comes from various contexts. To build this objectivity that I talked about, you need to respect context of knowledge. You need to kind of move from, move into a profane domain where you see kind of a knowledge as a context specific, and do justice to that. Academic world and power, I think, is broad terms. I think that we see how and why so many architectural institutes in India, what are they doing, why are they exist, all kind of things, I think can tell you why the conceptual framework is so weak when it comes about academics and practice. We need to construct new framework for dialogue and learn from other perspective. I think this is one of the key things when you talk about actually architectural discourse, architectural writing. And I think this is something that someone has told me when I graduated with my master's degree, that embeddedness is the essence. We are here to create embedded conditions, and how these embedded conditions comes from. And once you establish some kind of a confidence in dealing with this embeddedness, which considered all the previous slides, I think you are really geared up for architectural discourse, architectural writing, architectural criticism, and so on and so forth. And very often, I think we look for right answer. And looking for right answer, we forget that whether have we addressed the right issue. And always differentiate this right answer versus addressing the right issue. That will really bring about, the new way of looking at architectural discourse. And I think this will help and enable not only writing on architecture, but will bring a lot of immense clarity, whether it's architectural education, architectural practice, or architectural writing or criticism. Thank you.